An ambulance siren blared, breaking the silence of the street in the heavy summer heat. The asphalt was melting in the hot sun, and in the center of this fiery chaos, a small, defenseless body lay on the sidewalk. The girl, barely able to breathe, was making hoarse sounds, her skin covered in pale sweat. Doctors worked hurriedly, trying to keep her between life and death, and the crowd gathered around her froze, torn between fear and hope. "She's suffocating. We need more oxygen," shouted one of the paramedics, reaching for the oxygen tank. The girl was put on a mask, and for a moment the tension eased a little, but only until heavy footsteps sounded. The policeman appeared like a shadow from a nightmare. Tall, with a sharp stare that radiated anything but sympathy. The crowd instinctively backed away. His uniform gleamed in the sun, reflecting power and cold. He stopped, looking at the girl as if he saw not a living person in front of him, but a problem to be fixed. "What's going on here?" he asked gruffly, glancing around at the doctors. "The girl needs oxygen right away," one of the medics answered, trying to speak calmly. "She's having an asthmatic attack. We are trying to save her life." The policeman squinted, as if there was a catch in the doctor's words. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Disperse. Everything is under control here," he said, but his voice carried no promise of help, only a threat. "We can't back down," the doctor began, but he didn't have time to finish. The policeman stepped forward, shoved the man with one hand and grabbed the oxygen mask with the other. The crowd gasped. The girl cried out weakly, her chest heaving, trying to get some air. The mask now hung in the policeman's hand like a trophy. "What are you doing? She's going to die without oxygen," a woman in the crowd shouted, but fear made her take a step back when the policeman turned around. His eyes were lightning bolts, his expression a contemptuous sneer. "I said it's under control. We don't need this show anymore," he threw, not noticing the girl starting to slump, her wheezing weakening. The silence that prevailed at that moment was unbearable. It screamed louder than any sound. People looked at the policeman, at the girl, at her life slipping away before their eyes. The sun, so bright a moment ago, seemed to darken, pressing its weight on those gathered. It was at that moment, at the edge of the crowd, that the heavy sound of footsteps was heard. Someone tall, powerful, was moving toward the center of the stage. His silhouette was vaguely visible against the sunset light, but his presence was already felt, like a thunderstorm ready to fall on injustice. The policeman took another step forward, his boots thudding on the hot asphalt as if counting down the last moments of a child's life. An icy mask of indifference froze on his face. It wasn't just following orders, it was something much colder, more personal. His gaze, full of arrogance, slid over the girl as if she were nothing more than a bag of trash someone had left in the middle of the sidewalk. "I said, disperse." His voice sounded like a whiplash, causing the crowd to take a step back. But the roar of outrage only grew. People could see the child's body twitching in weak convulsions, the doctors panicking as they tried to approach, but afraid of a direct confrontation with the authorities. "She's dying. Get back," the woman shouted from the crowd, but the officer didn't even turn his head. He was focused on his goal. His hand confidently reached for the machines attached to the girl. Like a slow, carefully calibrated display of power, he grasped the hose of the oxygen tank. "Officer, you don't understand. She's going to die." The doctor stepped forward, desperate to stop him. It was an attempt, dictated by duty, but too fragile against a man whose gaze burned with contempt. "I said, back off." The policeman turned and shoved the doctor so hard that he could barely stand on his feet. "Is this snotty show you're trying to stop me? You think I don't know what's going on? She's the one who's causing the riots in town. And now that I'm here, things will be different." His words struck the crowd like a hammer blow. His voice was not only indifferent, but clearly hateful. Someone tried to shout, but the words stuck in his throat. People watched as he slowly ripped off another tube, tearing the girl away from the vital machine. Her chest twitched as if her body was desperately trying to breathe in air, but couldn't anymore. "Are you crazy?" shouted a man from the crowd, stepping forward. "You're killing a child. Get out." The policeman turned around, his hand reaching for his holster as a warning. The eyes under his glasses glittered coldly, and the crowd froze. No one else dared to move. "She's not my child, and if you want her to stay alive, pray for her, not pry," he threw with a sneer, turning to the girl again. His enjoyment of the situation was frightening. It was not just an act of indifference, but a kind of perverse pleasure in demonstrating his superiority. He acted like a predator, slowly and cold-bloodedly destroying a life that meant nothing to him. The rumbling of the crowd intensified. Women wept, men clenched their fists in impotent rage. But everyone knew that one step forward and he would be trampled. Too many times the boots of power had left their marks with impunity on the lives of those whom this man considered beneath him. The doctor tried to approach again, his voice trembling. "Please, you have to stop. It's a child, it's just a child." The policeman turned around slowly, his face creased in a grin. "She's not a child. She's just like the rest of them, except that people like her need to be taught the rules." His words were the last straw. The air thickened with indignation, and people's faces burned with hatred and helplessness. The girl was no longer moving, and only the faint movement of her chest reminded them that life was still smoldering in her fragile body. At that moment, a new sound cut through the silence. Heavy, steady footsteps. The crowd looked around. Someone, tall, massive, was making his way through the rows. His broad shoulders and calm expression were like the roll of thunder before the storm. His eyes stared intently at the policeman, who was still oblivious to the approaching presence. That figure, as if the embodiment of something inevitable, was approaching. Every movement radiated a restrained power that needed no warning. The crowd parted, silently welcoming the new player in this grim scene. The crowd began to thicken around the scene where the tragedy was playing out in front of everyone. The girl's mother, with desperate tears in her eyes, was thrashing between the doctors and the policemen, as if trying to keep reality from shattering. She grabbed the arm of one of the medics, hoping that at least professionalism and common sense would prevail. "Please, she's suffocating. She won't have a chance if you don't help her," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a croak. But all attempts to calm the situation were overridden by the policeman's icy indifference. He took another step forward, as if all these people in front of him were nothing more than noise, a background to his actions. The doctor tried to stop him, standing in his way. "Officer, please, it's a baby. If you take away the oxygen, she'll die." The doctor spoke quickly, his hands shaking, but he didn't back down. The policeman gave him a look of contempt and shoved him to the side. The doctor flew away, hitting his back against the nearest wall. Someone in the crowd cried out, but no one dared to come closer. Only the girl's mother rushed forward, blocking the way. "No!" she screamed, wrapping her arms around the girl. "This is my daughter. You have no right. She's dying." The policeman stopped, his lips curved in a cold smirk. His gaze was mocking, as if he were enjoying the fight. "Right?" he hissed, leaning closer. "You have no rights here? Do you have any idea where you are? Get out of my way, or you'll get worse." The mother shook her head, not letting go of her daughter. Her eyes, red with tears, begged for at least a modicum of compassion. But it didn't happen. The policeman grabbed her roughly by the shoulder and pulled her aside, ignoring the way she fell to her knees, her palms wounding against the pavement. The girl, left unprotected, cried out weakly. Her thin voice sounded more like a moan. The policeman leaned over her and ripped the oxygen mask from her face with brutal brutality. The girl coughed, her chest heaving, trying to get some air, but instead there was only a hoarse sound. "Stop pretending," he said, clutching the mask in his hand like it was useless trash. "You're always looking for pity, always wanting to be seen as victims." His words sounded like a blow, and the crowd recoiled. The mother, crawling on her knees, tried desperately to reach her daughter, screaming for him to stop. "Please, this isn't about you. This is my daughter." Her voice broke, turning into a cry of pain. She grabbed the policeman's leg, trying to stop him, but he only pushed her away roughly. She fell back onto the pavement, her hands shaking and tears rolling down her face. "Get her out of here," the policeman threw toward the crowd, "or she'll join the others who don't know their place." The crowd started to get excited. People shouted, someone took out a cell phone to film what was happening. But no one dared to come closer. In this chaos, the girl lay there, her small hands clenched weakly as if she was trying to cling to life. Her breathing became intermittent, her chest no longer rising as surely as it had a few minutes ago. Every second seemed like an eternity, every movement a struggle on the edge of survival. The mother rose again, struggling to her knees, and rushed forward, ignoring the pain. She grabbed the policeman's arm, desperately trying to retrieve the oxygen mask. Her voice sounded hysterical. "You're killing her. That's my baby. She didn't do anything. Please, I'm begging you." She screamed, but all she got in response was a hard elbow that made her crawl backward, writhing in pain. The policeman looked back at the crowd, holding up his mask as a symbol of his authority. His gaze was cold and inhuman. "That's how it's done," he said, as if speaking to himself rather than to the people. "If you can't respect order, you don't belong here." The crowd shouted in unison. Some moved forward, but the fear was stronger. And in that moment, time seemed to stop. Silence hung over the place where a child's life was being extinguished before everyone's eyes. And in the center of this nightmare stood a man who didn't even consider himself guilty. The crowd, at first shocked, now began to boil like water in an overheated cauldron. Screams and whispers merged into a rumble that overpowered even the distant sounds of sirens. People could not believe what was happening right before their eyes. A young mother, broken by pain, crawled on her knees trying to reach the lifeless girl, while a policeman stood over her as if she were prey. His hand slid to the holster of his gun, threateningly stopping those who dared to step forward. "Get back!" His voice sounded like a gunshot. "Anyone else want to try?" The crowd froze. The doctor, who had previously tried unsuccessfully to insert an oxygen tube into the girl, froze, his hands trembling. But the desperation in the man's eyes overcame the fear. He stepped forward, holding the oxygen mask in front of him like a shield. "She's going to die. Do you understand that?" he shouted, his voice trembling but firm. "If you don't let us work, you have a child's death on your hands." The policeman only grinned, coldly and without emotion. His hand slid over the holster, opening the clasp. "I said to stand back," he said. "You don't want to know what will happen if you don't listen." Someone in the crowd shouted out, "You're crazy. You're not even human. Leave her alone." The policeman only turned, shooting a glance in the direction of the voice, and stepped to the side, brandishing his weapon. It was enough to make the men take a step back, their anger replaced by fear, but only for a moment. The young man in the black t-shirt closest to the policeman came forward sharply. His fists were clenched, his face flaming with anger. "You have no right. It's a baby, damn it. You're killing her," he shouted, taking a sharp step toward the officer. The policeman did not flinch. He slowly raised his hand, touching the weapon. The guy stopped, but his gaze remained full of hatred. "Calm down before I calm you down myself," the policeman said, his voice low and threatening, like a predator warning of an attack. Meanwhile, the girl's mother, finally gathering her last strength, rushed back to her daughter. She clung to the policeman, shaking with sobs. "Please, for God's sake, get away. She didn't do anything to you. Please," she shouted, but the policeman, throwing her off his shoulder, did so sharply that the woman fell again, hitting her head on the sidewalk. There was a loud gasp in the crowd. Someone shouted. People began to move closer, but the fear of weapons still kept them at a distance. The atmosphere was becoming unbearable. Every second stretched like an eternity, filled with screams, groans, and the sound of footsteps. "She's choking. Damn it, do something," shouted a woman with a baby in her arms, standing in the front row. Her voice was soaked with panic. Another man tried to walk forward, but stopped when the policeman grabbed his gun and pulled it from its holster. He didn't aim at anyone in particular, but he did enough to make everyone freeze. "Calm down. One more step and you'll know what the law is," he said, his voice smooth, almost maddeningly calm. In the midst of this horror, the doctor again made an attempt to approach the girl. He crawled closer, trying to stay out of the officer's sight. The crowd was silent, their eyes fixed on the slowly unfolding scene. The doctor reached out his hand toward the girl, but the policeman turned around at the last moment. "I said, don't touch her," he shouted, kicking the floor, causing the doctor to roll backwards. "You're killing her," shouted someone from the crowd. "You think you can get away with it? We can all see it." For a moment, there was tension in the air, as before a storm. The crowd began to move closer, in spite of the fear. People realized that they could no longer stand by and watch a child's life fade away before their eyes. The screams grew louder, and the chaos grew. The policeman, despite the escalating situation, remained steadfast, as if that was his goal, to break the will of everyone around him. The hum of the crowd grew, mingling with panicked screams. People began to move to the side, retreating before the chaos that increasingly covered the street like a wave. The policeman stood, unwavering, gun in hand, his face remaining as cold and indifferent as if everything going on around him didn't concern him. He was even smiling slightly, enjoying the way his brutality was breaking people's will. Suddenly, from far away, through this hum, there was a strange rhythmic sound. Heavy footsteps, so loud that they seemed to shake the air by themselves. A step, another, a third. The crowd froze. Someone turned around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. People began to part, forming a narrow passageway among themselves, as if something unknown was wading through their fear and anger. And there he was. Out of the shadows of the evening lights came a man whose mere appearance took the crowd's breath away. He was huge, as if the air itself were thickening around his massive body. His black jacket sat on him as if every thread threatened to tear from the strain of his powerful muscles. Sneakers glistened on his feet, but everyone's attention was drawn to his face. It was a face radiating fury and confidence. His eyes burned like embers and his jaw was clenched as if he were holding back a storm ready to erupt at any moment. It was Big Shaq. He moved slowly, confidently, his steps sounding like hammer blows. The crowd, sensing the incredible power of his presence, instinctively parted. No one dared to whisper, as if the air itself had frozen in obedience to the figure. The policeman, noticing him, frowned. His fingers tightened on the gun, but there was a spark of hesitation in his eyes. He took a step back, but stopped immediately, trying to regain his confidence. "And who are you?" he threw, his voice trembling, but he tried to hide it behind the harshness. "Back off. It's none of your business." Big Shaq stopped, a few meters away from the policeman. His gaze lowered to the girl lying on the pavement, her weak body struggling to cling to life. Then he looked at the mother who, drenched in tears and blood, was still trying to get up to protect her child. And only then did his eyes meet those of the policeman. "Did you touch the child?" Big Shaq's voice sounded as low as a thunderclap. His words cut through the air, filling the space around him. The policeman grinned, but it looked strained now. He raised his gun, pointing it at Big Shaq. "I said back off or you'll regret it." His voice no longer sounded as confident as it used to. The crowd held its breath. Everyone looked at Big Shaq, waiting to see what he would do next. But instead of stopping or even turning his attention to the weapon, Shaq moved forward, taking his time, but moving closer to the policeman with each step. His gaze remained cold, but inside him burned a rage that seemed capable of destroying this entire world. The policeman surrendered first. His hand trembled, the gun dipped a little lower. "I warned you," he shouted, but there was fear in his voice. Big Shaq stopped right in front of him. His huge hand, like lightning, suddenly shot forward and grabbed the gun. In one motion, he snatched it out of the policeman's hands and tossed it aside like a toy. The crowd went aghast. The policeman tried to resist, but Shaq grabbed him by his uniform and lifted him like a child above the ground. "You think you can play with lives because you wear a badge?" Shaq hissed. His voice was so low it sounded like it came from the ground. "Did you want to show you're stronger? Then go ahead and show me." With those words, he threw the policeman to the ground. The impact was so hard that the sound echoed off the ground. The policeman cried out, but before he could get up, Big Shaq leaned down and grabbed him by the neck, lifting him off the ground again. "Apologize. Apologize to that girl, to her mother, to everyone here." His voice sounded like an order that was impossible to resist. The policeman was panting, his face pale. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. The crowd began to chant. People who a moment ago had been afraid to take a step were now shouting loudly words of encouragement. It wasn't just a reaction to what was happening, it was a cry of retribution for everything they had seen. Big Shaq threw the policeman to the ground once more, standing over him like a giant over a broken toy. But he didn't move on. Instead, he turned to the girl. The medic took advantage of the moment and ran over to the child, hooking up oxygen. The crowd froze again, watching every movement. Shaq didn't say a word. He stood like a relentless guardian, protecting the child and her mother. The policeman, broken, crawled aside, his eyes expressing a fear he could no longer hide. That day was the beginning of the end of his career, and a lesson that no one on this street will forget. The crowd was suddenly silent, as if all the energy, all the rage and fear had condensed into one place. Everyone seemed to hold their breath as the massive figure of Big Shaq stepped forward from behind the crowd surrounding the scene. His heavy footsteps cut through the tense silence like shock waves. His dark jacket glistened in the sun, and his hands clenched into fists like hammers. Big Shaq's gaze was fierce, his eyes burning through the policeman as if highlighting all his sins. "What are you doing?" Shaq said, loud and clear, his voice rumbling like thunder. The policeman, who until then had seemed unshaken, turned around sharply, clutching his gun. His posture was tense, but it was suddenly obvious that this tension was born not of confidence, but of fear. His hand twitched as if he wanted to cover himself or draw his weapon, but froze in indecision. "It's none of your business," he said coldly, but his voice trembled. The policeman tried to maintain a mask of confidence, but even in his movements he felt threatened. Shaq took another step forward. His massive figure towered over the policeman, and in that moment it was clear that this was not mere physical superiority. This was the power of truth, directed directly against the personification of injustice. The crowd froze, not knowing what would happen next, but hope flared within every onlooker. "It's none of my business," Shaq said with cold, dangerous clarity. "When a child suffocates and you stand there like a smug executioner, it's everyone's business." The policeman tensed. His eyes darted between Shaq and the crowd, which began to move closer again. The people felt their fear dissolving, like a night gloom scattered with light. "I'm ordering you to stand down," the policeman shouted, grabbing his gun. But his movements were nervous, his hand trembling, as if he realized that not only Shaq, but justice itself was against him. "You think guns make you strong?" Shaq threw a look of contempt at the gun and took another step forward. Now he stood so close that the policeman was forced to step back, losing his balance. "You're not a hero. You're a coward who hides behind a badge and a gun." The crowd began to whisper, some shouting words of encouragement to Shaq. The policeman's confidence began to crack at the seams. He took a step back, then another. "Get out of the way," he shouted, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice was louder than before, but there was no strength in it now, only panic. Shaq did not move. He stood like a mountain, like an unstoppable force that could neither be stopped nor bypassed. "You wouldn't dare do that," Shaq said quietly but menacingly, his voice soaked with confidence. "Because if you make a single wrong move, I will make you answer for every mistake you make." The policeman turned pale. His eyes darted around as if he were looking for a way out, but the crowd had already closed in around them. He had nowhere to go, and Shaq knew it. "She'll die if you don't stop," Shaq said, not taking his eyes off the policeman. His words sounded like a final judgment. "If you think for a second that I'm going to let you go on, you're sorely mistaken." The crowd began to move closer, people no longer afraid. The policeman looked at them, then back at Shaq. His hand clutched his gun, but in that moment it was clear. He had lost. He had nothing to oppose the man whose strength lay not only in physical power, but in truth. Shaq took the last step, coming close to the officer. His voice, deep and menacing, sounded like the last clap of thunder before the storm. "You're on my case now." The moment stretched into eternity. The crowd, breathless, watched every movement. The policeman, gun clutched in his hand, tried to maintain control, but Big Shaq stood before him, like the embodiment of a force that could not be stopped. And before the officer could think of what to do next, Shaq knocked the weapon out of his hand with a lightning-fast movement. The metal hit the pavement with a clang, and the crowd exploded with cheering shouts. People shouted, "Justice! Show him!" Component placement, their voices overflowing with emotions that had been building up for years. The policeman, realizing that his weapon would no longer save him, stepped back, but Shaq no longer left him time to think. His next blow, focused and powerful, came straight at the officer's chest. The air left his lungs and he swayed, losing his balance. "You think you're in charge here?" Shaq growled, his voice like a thunderclap that made the policeman freeze. "Non Badu, you're on trial today." The policeman tried to regain control, straightening up, trying to look confident. His hand reached for the baton on his belt, but Shaq had already taken the next step, closing the distance threateningly. His eyes burned with rage, and his movements were precise and ruthless. "You touched a child. You dared to use your power against those weaker than you," Shaq continued, emphasizing each word. "That's not power, that's cowardice." The policeman swung his baton toward Shaq, but his attack was too slow. Shaq, as if anticipating his every move, ducked and then knocked the weapon out of his hands with a whipping blow. The crowd erupted in a deafening roar, cheering the hero who had finally fought back against oppression. The policeman fell to his knees, his face contorted with pain and humiliation. But he was not going to give up. He threw a glance toward the crowd, full of rage, and shouted, "You don't understand. He's assaulting an employee. That's a felony." Shaq stepped forward silently, grabbed the policeman by the collar, and lifted him as if he weighed no more than a feather. The crowd froze, waiting to see what would happen next. The policeman tried to break free, his face pale and his eyes darting from Shaq to the people around him. "A crime?" Shaq said, his voice low and icy, as if the very air around him was growing heavier. "The crime is your actions. It's what you did to that girl, and to every victim you look down on." Shaq threw the policeman to the ground, and he landed with a thud. His hands shook as he tried to get up, but Shaq's next blow hit him in the side, causing him to collapse again. People were screaming. Someone was crying, but not a single person in the crowd tried to stop Shaq. This was more than a fight. This was retribution for all those who had suffered injustice. The policeman tried to crawl back, his breathing becoming heavy and intermittent. But Shaq did not let him get away. He stepped his foot on the officer's chest, preventing him from rising, and loomed over him like a mountain. "Did you think your uniform gave you the right to humiliate others?" Shaq asked, his voice full of contempt. "Today, you'll feel what it's like to be in their shoes." The policeman coughed, his eyes wide with horror. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Shaq stood over him like the embodiment of punishment, and the crowd screamed for justice. "Stop it!" shouted someone in the crowd. "We have to get help for the girl." Shaq looked at the small body lying on the pavement, then back at the policeman who was no longer trying to resist. He let him go and turned to the girl. The men backed away, giving Shaq the way, and he slowly approached the child. His eyes were full of determination. "Medics over here," he said briefly. And the medics, sensing the danger was over, rushed to the girl, hooking up the oxygen again while Shaq stood nearby guarding them. Behind him, the policeman, defeated and humiliated, remained lying there, his hands shaking and his face wet with sweat. The crowd was no longer paying attention to him. Their eyes were fixed on Shaq, who had restored people's sense of justice. Shaq grabbed the officer sharply by the collar of his uniform, like a predator catching prey. His powerful arms tensed, and in the next second he lifted the officer off the ground as if he weighed nothing. The policeman wheezed, trying to break free but to no avail. Shaq looked him straight in the eye, and there was so much rage in that look that the crowd around him held its breath for a moment. "This is for her," Shaq thundered, nodding toward the girl, who now lay motionless, surrounded by doctors trying to restore her breathing. His voice sounded like a thunderclap, harsh and unrelenting. Shaq threw the policeman to the ground like a piece of trash. He fell to the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust. His face contorted with pain and humiliation, but he immediately tried to get up, grasping the ground with trembling hands. The camera of every phone in the crowd was pointed at him. People shouted words that mixed anger and cheers. "Get up!" Shaq shouted, stepping forward. His massive figure obscured the sun, and the policeman, who had stopped for a moment, tried to rise again, but his legs failed him. "Yeah, he started to say, but Shaq didn't let him finish. "You've said enough," Shaq interrupted sharply. His voice was low and threatening, lacking even a hint of sympathy. He lifted his foot and placed it on the officer's chest, pinning him to the ground. "You thought you could do whatever you wanted, that your uniform was a license for cruelty. But today you learned what real justice is." The crowd murmured louder. Someone shouted, "Yeah, show him." People gathered closer, their phones glowing, filming every movement. The policeman was squirming helplessly. Dirt stuck to his face, and his eyes darted around, looking for a way out. But there was no way out. Shaq stood over him like the epitome of punishment, and everyone in the crowd sensed that this was the moment they had been waiting for. "You humiliated those who were weaker, used your power to spread fear. But now..." Shaq leaned closer, his face a few centimeters from the officer's. "Now you'll know what it's like to kneel before someone stronger." The officer tried to shout something, but his voice was drowned in the general rumble of the crowd. Shaq yanked him sharply by the collar, lifting him off the ground, only to toss him to the sidewalk again. The policeman fell, hitting his shoulder, and groaned. He was covered in dirt, his uniform no longer looking like a symbol of power. Now it was a pitiful reminder of what he had lost. "Look at her," Shaq shouted, pointing at the girl. His voice echoed down the street, silencing everyone. It was you who brought this on. Every move you made, every action you took was to take her life. And for what? Because you thought you were better?" The policeman turned his head with difficulty, his eyes filled with fear. But Shaq did not let him look away. He knelt down, holding him by the collar, and whispered, but in a way that the whole crowd could hear, "Today you're going to learn what it means to take responsibility for your actions. And that's just the beginning." The crowd exploded with applause and shouts. People shouted words of approval. Some even cried with relief. The policeman, lying on the ground, no longer resisted. He knew he had lost. His face expressed not only pain, but also the full realization of his humiliation. Shaq stood up, leaving the officer lying there. His gaze was cold and unyielding. He turned to the crowd, which had now parted, giving the doctors room to get to the girl. Shaq walked over to the child's mother, helping her up. "This isn't over," he told her quietly but firmly. He would answer for everything. The mother, still crying, nodded, clutching Shaq's hand. The crowd, still filming, now pointed their cameras at the child, hoping that this horror would end with some hope of life. And in the center of it all stood Shaq, as if he were an angel of justice himself, coming to deliver justice. Shaq slowly bent over, picking up the oxygen mask from the ground. It was stained, but it could still save a life. His large hands, which had so easily broken the strength and arrogance of the policeman, now moved with the utmost care. Shaq, as if oblivious to the crowd, focused on the child. His gaze had softened, but inside he was still raging with fury at the one who had brought the situation to this point. The crowd, which had just been shouting and cheering, suddenly fell silent. Everyone froze, watching Shaq as if he were the only person who could stop the madness. People stood in a tight circle, holding their phones, recording every detail, every movement. No one spoke a word except the girl's mother. She sobbed, keeping her eyes on her daughter. "Thank you. Please do something. Please," she begged, her voice trembling. She fell to her knees beside her daughter, grasping her small hand. Shaq handed the mask to the doctor, who immediately grabbed it and connected it to the oxygen tank. The medic's hands were shaking, but he acted quickly and professionally. With each passing second, the tension in the air became unbearable. The crowd held its breath, as if the whole world hovered for a single moment. The doctor carefully placed the mask on the girl's face. Everyone waited. Her tiny body, motionless until then, suddenly shuddered. Then there was a quiet but most precious sound of the day, a faint breath. Her chest rose slowly, then lowered. She took another breath, and then another. The girl's chest continued to move, and her face, previously pale, began to take on a tinge of life. The mother, realizing that her daughter was breathing again, sobbed louder. She clung to her child, hugging her as if she was afraid to let her go. There was everything in her tears: relief, gratitude, but also the pain of what they were going through. "Thank you, she whispered, looking at Shaq. Her voice was weak but sincere. Shaq nodded without saying a word. His eyes focused on the girl, who was breathing more evenly now. The doctor was checking her pulse, placing the stethoscope against her small chest. After a few long moments, he looked up, his face expressing relief. "She will live," he said quietly, but loud enough for the crowd to hear. As if on cue, people burst into applause and shouts of joy. Some cried, others hugged, still others shouted words of gratitude to Shaq and the doctor. It was like a collective release from a nightmare that had lasted too long. Shaq slowly straightened up. His figure towered over the crowd like a symbol of strength and justice. He turned to the girl's mother, who was now holding her daughter's hand without taking her eyes off her. "She'll be fine," Shaq said calmly. There was no pathos in his voice, just the firm calm of a man who had done his best. But the tension was not completely gone. Off to the side, still lying in the mud, was a policeman. His face, which had once expressed confidence and cold cruelty, was now contorted with fear and humiliation. He tried to crawl backward, but his movements were erratic, as if he were afraid to get up and face the stares of the crowd. Shaq turned his head, his gaze fixed on the officer. The crowd followed his example. At that moment, the policeman was the center of attention, and every person in the crowd looked at him with hatred. Cameras were pointed at him, capturing his shame. Shaq stepped toward him, his massive boots thudding on the pavement. The policeman tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His lips quivered, and his eyes darted around, looking for support that wasn't there. "Look at her," Shaq said, his voice low and cold. He nodded toward the girl. "You almost took her life. For what? To show you're stronger? You think your badge makes you better than the others?" The policeman opened his mouth, but Shaq didn't let him finish. "Shut up. You've said enough," he interrupted sharply. "Your time has passed." The crowd supported him with shouts. Someone shouted, "Let him answer for his deeds." Others shouted words of approval for Shaq. The policeman, realizing that his situation was hopeless, covered his face with his hands as if this could protect him from humiliation. Shaq took a step back, keeping his eyes on him. His face remained stern, but there was a look of weariness in the depths. He turned to the crowd, which now stood in a tight circle around him. "This is not the end," he said loudly, addressing everyone. "Justice starts here. We will not let people like him continue to kill us." The crowd erupted into shouts of approval. People applauded, shouting his name. The cameras kept rolling. The policeman, crouched on the ground, looked like a broken man, unable to defend himself anymore. Shaq looked once more at the girl's mother, who seemed unable to believe that her child was breathing. She looked at him and then burst into tears again, this time with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Shaq nodded. He didn't need thanks. All he wanted was for justice to be served, for evil like this to never happen again. There was silence all around, but it was not the kind of silence that precedes chaos, but the kind that marks the coming of change. Shaq, oblivious to the camera flashes and the roar of the crowd, carefully handed the oxygen mask to the doctor. He stood nearby, watching as the medical team hurriedly restored the girl's oxygen supply. Her faint breath was barely noticeable, but the crowd held its breath, watching every movement. The baby's chest began to rise slowly, and this small gesture was a symbol of hope. "She's breathing," shouted one of the doctors, and the crowd erupted in applause. People hugged each other, some crying with relief, and the girl's mother fell to her knees beside her daughter, sobbing. "Thank you, thank you," she repeated, looking at Shaq as if he were a savior. Her voice was shaky, but her gratitude was genuine. Shaq only nodded, his face remaining serious. His work was not yet done. He glanced back to look at the policeman who was still lying on the sidelines. All his confidence and arrogance was gone, replaced by fear and a full realization of his guilt. His dirty uniform, his gun knocked out of his hands, and his disheveled hair were all but a reminder of his defeat now. At that moment, several police cars pulled up to the scene, their sirens filling the street. The officers' colleagues quickly got out of the cars, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. One of them, apparently a senior officer, headed towards Shaq and the medical team. "What happened here?" he asked, but his voice was full of tension, as if he already knew the answer. Shaq stepped forward, his massive figure causing the officer to stop. The crowd fell silent again, watching the scene. Shaq pointed to the policeman lying in the dirt. "This man threatened the child and prevented the doctors from saving her life. He must answer for it." His voice was firm, unyielding. The senior officer nodded slowly, gesturing to his subordinates. The policeman in the dirty uniform tried to justify himself, his voice shaking. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job," he shouted, but his words were drowned out by the noise. The crowd no longer believed him. His lies had been exposed, and no one was going to listen to him. "Doing his job?" someone in the crowd said loudly. "You almost killed a child." The officer was lifted off the ground and handcuffed. His face contorted with humiliation as he was led to the car, and the crowd gathered around him began chanting, "Big Shaq! Big Shaq!" The name echoed down the street, echoed in every phone that captured the moment, and reflected a sense of justice finally being served.